Chris Adams here. Wonderful you could join us today in what is a very fast-moving and challenging, but certainly fascinating period in our industry's history. So to try and make sense of it and to bring some of the most current and up-to-date information that we currently have, I'm joined by two of our oldest friends and colleagues in the industry. First of all, Dave Bratton, who's founder and a very close friend and colleague over the last 15 years in research, Dave Bratton. And Dave, I know you recently had a remarkable trip to Japan, talking about travel.
Yes, Chris, thanks. Yeah, I just got back. I spent a week up in the far northern mountains of Japan, soaking in hot springs, and got to tick off one of my big bucket list items, which was to go spend a day in Tokyo watching sumo wrestling, which was absolutely extraordinary. So it was a wonderful trip.
Yes, and I would highlight Japan. I was lucky enough to be there late last year around the Rugby World Cup, and they had a super typhoon, and both with that natural disaster and now the epidemic, I know the Japanese are extremely organized, and their response to COVID-19 has been one of the real standouts. So learning lessons and best practices from how others are grappling with this challenge is going to be one of the sort of key ways forward. And let me also introduce another old friend and colleague, and face, even though you can't see this gentleman right now, Martin Stoll, CEO of Sparkloft Media, familiar to many of you. Martin, whereabouts are you in this shot?
This photo was taken 4 weeks ago in the beautiful country of Belize on Key Cocker.
Very good. So Martin is going to be joining us to talk about the latest insights and takeaways from social media monitoring and listening that they've been doing.
So for those of you who are familiar with the State of the American Traveler research that we do this research in support of Southeast Tourism Society, as well as our friends at DMA West, and we appreciate their support as we work to get the word out and this messaging around what we can be doing in light of COVID-19. For those of you who are taking, used to taking notes, etc., obviously there's a lot of great insight here, but we want you to know ahead of time that we will be posting the full State of the American Traveler Destinations Edition report on our website, Miles' website, as well as Destination Analyst's website afterwards with a lot of great insight. We'll also be recording the session, and we'll make that available within definitely the next 24 hours, if not sooner. So most of you at this point are familiar with the conferencing software, but we encourage you guys to ask questions as we go through. We have just the little box within your control panel there where you can add questions as we go, and we will take the majority of questions at the end of the session. Okay, so just following up to Chris's intro there, in terms of what we're going to be covering, Dave is going to be highlighting some of the kind of relevant information from our research, our quarterly research that we expect will really serve as a great baseline for us as we look forward to doing some additional, more timely research in light of what's happening with the virus. We're excited that Martin's going to join us, and we'll dive into those active updates on the sentiment report, and then we'll share with you guys some additional resources before we dive into the Q&A. And so just a couple of some links here that we are going to include in the follow-up email that everybody who registered will receive after the session. And just a reminder that we want to be accessing the most authoritative resources as we aim to deal with the with the virus itself. And so we will provide you guys with some of the resources that we have found most valuable as well. All right, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We're excited to be able to present this information to you. And my job is to talk about the Destinations edition of the State of the American Traveler, which is quite frankly my favorite edition of the 4 that we do every year. Every year we do a quarterly study with Miles's support. And this one's a great one because we explore, why people are choosing the destinations they are, where people want to go, and we have a bunch of brand indexes that we look at to see how specific destinations are doing. Unfortunately, we collected this data in January, which kind of has one foot in the coronavirus world and one foot out. It was when things were starting to get pretty heated in China, but it hadn't yet come to US shores in any big way. So it kind of dropped a hand grenade in the middle of our plans to do this webinar. There's a lot of great useful information in this report, but we really don't want to be tone deaf and present stuff that nobody's thinking about right now, given the intensity and speed with which the outbreak has come upon us. So we have two sections I'm going to present to you. One is dealing with traveler optimism, and I want to present that as kind of a baseline for where we were before coronavirus really started to be a problem here. And hopefully that'll give us some insight into where we can be when we move beyond this. And then we're going to talk a little bit about resource usage, what people use to plan their travel, with kind of the idea of thinking about what's next. How do we deal with what's next, and is there anything going on that requires a change of plan, basically. So let's talk first about the coronavirus and how people are feeling about it. We've been looking at all sorts of research that's been done, and there's unfortunately not a whole lot about the travel intentions of Americans right now. We're going to be launching a survey today, hopefully that'll be part of a bigger project we'll be doing with Miles and Sparkloft, and looking at different indices to help us anticipate when the demand will return for travel. But one of the secondary pieces of research that we found, which I think was really valuable, was done by Bain and Company. And I'm going to talk through this real quickly just to give you a sense of how people might be feeling. And they looked at 2 things. They looked at health concerns, how concerned people are about their personal health, and then financial concerns too. And their biggest takeaway basically is that Americans right now are a little bit more worried about their finances than the health effects of COVID-19. And what you see on the chart right now is the health concern side of it. And they used a 10-point scale from not expecting any impact to expecting a serious impact. And this was conducted just a few days ago, so it's relatively timely. And we can see in this that about 1/3 of Americans believe that the coronavirus is basically just a flu, not really worried about it that much. But then the rest of the country, about 2/3, have more heightened levels of concern, and only 1 in 6 are highly concerned about the health impacts of the virus. Still, that's a ton of people, and they have good reason to be concerned. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the health sides. It's a little bit different for financial concerns, which I'll show you now. You can see 1/4 believe that there'll be little to no impact on them financially. About half feel there'll be some level of an elevated concern, and 1 in 5, a little bit more than the 1 in 6 you saw for the health side, feel that there's going to be a financial impact to them. So this may not paint the picture of the panic that the media, we can see in the media, but there's definitely about 2/3 of us that are significantly concerned about it for our health and our finances. But like I said, we're going to be releasing some indices and data to help us anticipate better in the travel industry very soon. So let's shift to the State of the American Traveler data. And as I said, I'm going to, if I can, I'm going to share 2 pieces of data or information from this with you, which hopefully will be relevant. And the first part of it I feel is relevant in understanding where we were when this hand grenade was dropped, basically. And that's traveler optimism. This is based on a survey of 2,000 American leisure travelers. representative sample of Americans that we conduct every quarter. So basically what we saw in this most recent edition, we do some tracking questions where we ask about plans for travel in the next 12 months and plans for travel spending in the next 12 months compared to what you did before and in the past year. And what we saw is that there was an uptick in expected travel volume, but there's a really big uptick in what people were expecting to spend on travel for leisure. And I think this is important to understand where we came from, but also when this is all done 2 or 3 months from now, hopefully, you're going to be seeing economic impact studies come out, which are going to be comparing to a baseline, which is most likely 2019. But I just want you to all to understand that what we would have seen in 2020 probably would have exceeded 2019 significantly, given how consumers were feeling in January. And let's just look at that data. We ask in the next 12 months, do you expect to spend more or less for leisure travel than you did in the most recent 12-month period? 36.5% of us in January said, yeah, well, I'm going to spend more on leisure travel this year. But let's look at this over time. We can see from a year ago, same point in time, we've gone up from 32.2% to 36.5%. So a pretty significant jump. Very similar to what we saw in the past, but the last year was not a particularly good one for leisure travel. So from that point of view, things were looking good in January. One of the things we track is what's keeping people from traveling, kind of to understand why we are going to increase or decrease our travels. And 3 things which are always big are personal financial concerns, gas prices, and airfare. And we can see on this chart on the far right that all 3 took a dip in January. So people were less concerned about their financial concerns, less of an impediment to travel. Gasoline was much less of an impediment to travel than in the fall, and airfare was down just a little bit. But overall, people were feeling good about what was keeping them off the road, I think. And then really interestingly, we ask about travel as a budget priority, and you can see here in blue that the majority of Americans were going to prioritize leisure travel spending in their family budgets this year. And when we look at that over time, we can see a really big jump from the summer of 2019 to now. So people were feeling good about where they were going to place budget for travel, and their expected travel budget for the year were also up significantly from about $3,200 to $3,800. We asked them what the maximum you'd be willing to spend, and the chart for all your travels for leisure, and the chart here shows you the mean for that. So overall, we were looking really good, and like I said, just keep this in mind because there may be a bounce back too. There may be a lot of pent-up demand when things clear up, like I say, hopefully soon, and keep it in mind too for all the economic analysis you're going to see in the future. So let's talk quickly about travel planning resources used, and I really wanted to show this because you may be out there thinking, well, how am I going to make my communications plan with the world, and if things changed in a way, are they changing in a way that necessitates some concern? So one of the things we do every edition of this is we ask, well, what type of resources have you been using to plan your travel? And 3 of the big ones here, so maybe surprisingly to you, but print resources are used by many Americans still to plan their travel. Mapping sites like Google Maps and user-generated content resources all are major sources of travel. And they've all been fairly stable over the last 5 years, you can see from the chart here. People use a variety of resources. That's one thing that's clear from this research is there's not one major source that people are using. So one of the ones that's grown recently quite a bit has been video. If you're thinking about communication through video, about a quarter of American leisure travelers are using video to plan their trips. And interestingly, about half of those people say they usually use it or they always use it for every trip. Almost 20%, 18.4%, said that they always use video to help plan their trips. So video is definitely something we want to keep in mind as we're reaching out to people. And the thing, how they use it, well, they use it for things to see and do, places to stay, and destinations they want to visit as the top 3. Perfect fit for the DMOs out there on the audience today, because as we know from many focus groups and qualitative research projects that we've done, that the traveling public looks at DMOs as the things to see and do people. You know, you're the experts in what's going on in a place, and that's primarily how people view you, or leisure travelers do. So there's a good setup there for that. DMO resources in general have been strong and continue to play an important role in how people plan. And you can see here the percent that used a printed vacation planning guide or a digital one in blue over here at the right. And if we look at it over time, 25%, basically a quarter of American leisure travelers use printed guides or have used it in the past year. And we can see that this has also remained fairly stable over time. So that's a go-to resource for a lot of people, and one that continues to stay strong. Websites of DMOs, 32.8% said they've used it in the past year. And again, the same story. If we look at it over time, about a third of us are using DMOs as a trusted resource for travel planning. So that's all good news that we haven't seen any weakness there. One of the interesting points around that, those that had used a DMO website in the past, well, at what point in your planning did you actually use it? And 2 out of 3, 63%, said that they used it before they decided to travel to the destination. So again, showing a huge ability there to reach out and actually create a conversion to travel from people who are not decided yet. So in the final resource that I'm going to talk about today are digital influencers, and it's kind of a setup for Martin, who's going to talk about their social listening research, which is fascinating. And right now, about 13% of us say they've used digital influencers to help their leisure travel. And just so you know, we gave them a good definition of what that means, because that's kind of a term that we in marketing throw about, but the typical person out there may not understand. But I think we gave them a good, clear understanding of it. And this has been, over the last couple of years, we've asked this 3 times now. It's been a little bit in decline, interestingly, but people are obviously out there listening to what travel experts have to say. So I'm going to leave it here, and just with one thing that we're, as I said, we're going to be launching a major survey every week from now on to try and track how consumers or travelers are feeling about this, and with the goal of helping to anticipate when demand will return. We're also going to be looking at meeting planners as part of that as well, and working with Miles and Sparkloft. So Chris can talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dave. And just a reminder, the full research report will be available as a link from the email that will follow this webinar within 24 hours. So you can have a look at the range of the other insights from the Destinations edition, including what types of destinations people are selecting, how that's trended over time. And you saw from the summary of sources of information, we've called it the hyper-informed traveler, the complex and fragmented use of different media types. And even in a crisis that we're facing now, having a multimedia strategy, so you're communicating across different platforms, so you're adapting and customizing your content to these different platforms so you can ensure you're getting the right message out to the right people at the right place. So let's pass it now over to Martin. And Sparkloft is one of the industry leaders in terms of social media management and marketing. And they work with destinations, airlines, and other tourism brands across the planet, including a lot of work we do with them on Brand USA. And they've been building over several years now expertise in terms of understanding the sentiment and perception of travelers using social media monitoring tools. So Martin, what are you seeing now?
Perfect, thank you. Let's see if I can advance the slides on my screen. Perfect. So hello everybody, my name is Martin with Sparkloft Media. We're, as Chris said, we're a social media agency, and for the last 5 years we've used social media data to help our clients understand better what consumers are thinking, to adjust marketing programs and so on. We have since January worked on the Corona crisis because we have a cruise client in Asia, and for them the crisis started a lot earlier, and have now for a couple of weeks done a weekly report where we analyze what people are saying on social media about the coronavirus and how it impacts travel. So I want to take you quickly through the methodology, show you how we do that, and then show you very briefly some of the data. You will have the details in the email that's going to go after, and then have enough time to really show you what the data means and what you can do with it. And this, as was mentioned before, it is a very, very fluid situation, and I'll show you a couple of examples on how quickly things are shifting. So why social sentiment? How does this work? So basically, anytime you go on social media and you post something that is publicly available on Twitter, on Facebook, on Reddit, on TripAdvisor, or any of the forums, that data can be used by companies to get the data and analyze it. So the process that we have for this, we use a third-party tool that is a very fancy machine that sucks in all the public social media data. Some of the data has geolocation, so from where are people posting. Some of it has demographic information. It's limited, but there's some. The data comes straight from the social platforms in most cases and is not scraped. And then there is machine learning that looks through what people are posting and analyzing, is it positive, negative, what's the sentiment in it, and what are the key themes that are emerging. So the way we use this is, and I'll show you a couple of examples, we formulate a hypothesis, then we go in and say what keywords are relevant to the conversations around this hypothesis, what keywords are not relevant for it. We fine tune the keywords, and then you can slice the data in many different ways. You can look at it day over day, week over week, year over year. You can look at it on a geo filter and saying, is it different in California than it is in Washington State? And where it really becomes powerful if you look at it along a timeline. Sort of give you one example what these reports look like, and then we're going to dive deeper in. So this is using coronavirus as an example. You see on the right side how the conversation spikes, where we now get on a global level more than 6 million social posts a day that can be analyzed, and 3 examples of how the machine learning categorizes these posts into negative, post about the flight that came back where to the United States, neutral, or a positive slide where relief was sent to China. So this is all done by machine learning. It's not perfect, but over millions of posts that are analyzed, the trend, I think, is highly accurate. So to give you super quickly five examples on how we have used social media in the past, because for sentiment analysis, because it's really, really important when you look at the data, it always starts with a question. You want to have a very clearly defined question that you ask, and then using the social data to answer the question. The better the question, the clearer the question, the better your insights are going to be. So just examples for questions we've used in the past. So we worked with a destination client in California on the question, how is homelessness impacting the brand of the destination? We've used it with clients in Alaska to say, who would really want to go to Alaska in the middle of winter when it's dark there? Can we use social data to analyze the consumer that would be interested in that, and then build a marketing program around it? It's questions like that we unfortunately had to use social media a lot in the past. That's very relevant here, whether it's hurricanes, earthquakes, mudslides, fires. What is the consumer thinking? What's their mindset? When is it okay for a DMO to go back to marketing? Because the sentiment in your destination that was hit by a crisis might be very different than a market that's further away, where people are thinking about booking a trip 6 months out, and you want to be in front of them, but when is the timing right? We have also worked with state DMOs on saying, can we use social media data to look at product destination development? Is there social data that supports building out product for outdoor, for example? So these are just some examples that we, to show you how the questions that we ask. So for coronavirus, the questions we've been asking for the last weeks, and we have produced reports is what is the conversation about the coronavirus? What are people saying about coronavirus and travel? And for the report this week, we try to do a special theme every week. We specifically looked at the impact it has on corporate travel and events being canceled, because this was the theme for this week, and you could already see it coming last week. For next week, the plan is to do a report with an emphasis on spring break and leisure travel, because you'll see in our data, that's our prediction what's gonna come and be hit next. So let's go quickly through the data. I'm not gonna spend a ton of time on that part. Just to show you, this is the global conversation for about coronavirus. So we put in any variations of the corona, COVID-19, COVID, and all that stuff, and it picks up all those conversations and then sorts them in neutral, positive, negative. You can see that over the last 2 weeks globally, the conversation has really picked up. The negative sentiment has picked up. This is on a global level. When we zoom in, and you can look at it for the last 2 weeks, you can see some of the events that are driving the conversation, like the World Health Organization talking about the mortality rate, Italy going under lockdown, and so on. And you can see, you can see on a geographic level where are those conversations happening, and you can, in theory, you could go in and drill down more on a country by country basis. But for the sake of this webinar, we just want to look at the sentiment in the US. So we then do the same thing for the United States, and that's where it gets more interesting. The volume of conversation over the last 2 weeks spikes a lot more in the United States. You will hear a common theme that I'm going to talk about in this. We're looking at the data. Our strong belief is that the United States is 2 to 3 weeks behind the rest of the world, especially Europe. So a lot of the stuff that you see in Europe sort of happens with a time delay here in the United States. You can look at, again, the conversation drivers specifically in the United States on what are people talking about, when is it spiking. And for any of those data points here, we could go in and drill down and saying, why is the negative sentiment on the 27th of February, why did it spike so much? What specifically were people talking about? Who were driving those conversations? And then we can look at the map and see, so obviously there is a correlation at the moment between the states with the highest population, where there's the most people using social media. So it's not surprising that more people are talking about it in California than in Vermont. But it will be interesting over time to see, as our prediction is that the outbreak will play out differently in different parts of the country, to see how the conversations will bring greater geographic differences between the different states or regions. So at the moment, it follows along the lines of where people are living. And then, so this is where we really take a deeper dive. We take all the conversations in the United States about the coronavirus, and we filter it down to conversations that we can identify as conversations that are related to travel. So people who mention in the same post or tweet or blog post or whatever, coronavirus plus the words trip planning, road trip, travel, like any hotel, sort of any of those words. It's like hundreds and hundreds of words. And what you see here, what's different than the other first reports that I showed, the conversation is still spiking, and our prediction is next week the conversation volume will be much higher than even it was this week. And you see the negative sentiment rising for social media sentiment around coronavirus and travel in the United States. When you look at sort of what's driving the conversations, it was a lot of stuff around event cancellations, South by Southwest, Indian Wells tennis tournament, and stuff like that. And the cruise ship circling around the San Francisco Bay and waiting where it would ultimately land. So those were conversations drivers in the last week. You can again look at where the conversation is happening, which is not sort of fundamentally different yet at the moment. However, our prediction is, especially for travel, we will start to see greater differences between the different states or regions in the United States. And then we can go in and create a sort of analyze what are people talking about. So what you see here are two different word clouds comparing the conversations, what are the keywords in the overall conversation about the coronavirus, this is the data from last week, versus filtered down to just travel conversations. And when you look at travel conversations, you see the stuff that people are talking about is cruise ship, passengers, ship, conference, and stuff like that. Two words that I want to point out on the bottom is the discounted and on the right side, cheap. And I'll come back to that in a second. And conference and meeting speaking to corporate travel. But this was the travel sentiment in general on travel. We then drilled down deeper and compared travel now to conversations specifically around corporate travel and events, because that was a big theme last week where, you know, the corporate travel market really got its rug pulled out under with companies doing travel bans and stuff like that, and the events being canceled. So you see a lot of stuff around postpone, South by Southwest, events, conference, cancel, meetings, festival, and so on. So now let's look at sort of the themes and sort of there's again 6 million posts a day, so we distill it down to the most important ones, or the ones that we think represent the stuff that we see in the data the best. So obviously lots of people talking about airline cancellations and trips being canceled. I want to point out the post in the middle with the red box around it, which is interesting, where there is conversations, people saying, where I'm going is not under state of emergency yet, but when it is, will I get my money back? So, conversations around cancellations. But at the same time, the airlines have done a very good job with having cheap fares and flexible cancellations. There is people who are talking about now is the time to travel, especially younger people, millennials and Gen Z, who are saying we're anyway not gonna die of coronavirus, as morbid as it sounds. Let's get on a plane because we're only young once and now's the time to travel. So there is at the moment customer segments who are jumping on these deals. When you look at specifically corporate travel and events, that's what the stuff that we took a deeper dive in this week. One of the things we're seeing is seen over the last week that when conferences get canceled, it usually starts with speakers pulling out. There's a pattern. So speakers saying we don't feel comfortable coming to this conference anymore. My company doesn't allow me to travel anymore. And then first speakers cancel, then attendees cancel, then the conference gets canceled. It's also not necessarily about people being afraid that they're gonna get sick, but a big fear that people will get stuck somewhere and then they don't wanna travel anymore because of that risk. And then when you look at the conversation and the sentiment around trips that are being canceled, a lot of the conversation is around business trips, and people are not being super emotional about it, right? Because if they lose money, it's the company that lose money, or if they don't go to a meeting, it's not the end of the world. We predict this will change as next week or the weeks to come, leisure travel will be more impacted, so it's gonna get more emotional. So our point of view, sort of what do we read in the data? Some of I already mentioned, so I'm just gonna summarize this quickly. The volume of conversation and negative sentiment around coronavirus in the United States is increasing rapidly. The last week, corporate travel had a big impact on the conversation. The flexible cancellation policies are in sentiment terms are seeing very positive. People are talking about those and talking about booking travel because it's cheap and flexible. And the age groups in the US are reacting differently to canceling travel or booking travel. When we talk to clients about what they should do with this data, what we tell them at the moment is we think leisure impact will come next week or in the weeks to come. We recommend DMOs to really work with their local hotels, especially the ones that are smaller and might not be part of a Marriott or Hilton, where there is bigger sort of corporate policies on flexible cancellations, to really think about that, because we think at the moment the messaging, we have great deals and flexible cancellation. What you have to lose is working for airlines. It should be the same for hotels if they move in sync, and at least they can protect some of the bookings for now. And then we're talking with clients about looking at different customer segments and identifying those that seem to be less concerned about traveling at the moment. I think it will be interesting around spring break with so many schools canceling now. Are there people who are going to say, you know, we're just going to go on spring break early, it's cheap, or take extra time off, or are people really going to freeze? That's what we have to see. So I also talked about that we've been watching this for a while, and I just want to show you 2 quick slides how fluid the situation is. So these are the news headlines from the day before yesterday, where Pence was saying, you know, we are discussing travel advisories. Sort of, we saw the speech of the president yesterday. Now we know what that means. We had on Wednesday the first containment area. The health officials saying, you know, the sort of life as we know it is going to change significantly over the months to come. The CDC apparently wanted to have a stronger travel advisory. The Trump administration said we don't want that yet. And then we start seeing the cancellation, South by Southwest, Coachella, now the NBA, Major League Soccer just canceled. And just to show you how fast this moves, so we've been on this call, you know, now 40 minutes. We came on a little bit early as the presenters. While we were on the call, during that time, all Broadway shows have been canceled, Major League Soccer canceled, and the New York Times just has an article that the Trump administration is considering a travel ban to Washington State and other, quote, areas that are hot. So it's very, very fluid. And our point to clients is, or to anybody is, look at what's happening in Europe, because the US is sort of just behind. So I show you here the headlines for March 10th, this Wednesday. What did the headlines in Europe look like on the same day, or the day before? Italy sort of extended the quarantine to the entire country. The German hockey league, ice hockey league, just canceled the entire season. They won't even, they're going into playoffs. That's gone. There's going to be no champion this year. Norwegian Air is laying off 3,000 people. Sort of, my personal opinion is they're not going to be around much longer. France bans all gatherings with 1,000 people. Again, this was 2 days ago. Yesterday, state of Oregon, state of Washington say no more meetings or no more gatherings with more than 250 people. Angela Merkel, German chancellor, tells the German people 60 to 70% of the German population will contact the virus. And at the same time, there is reports that sort of in China, at least, the worst is over. We found JP Morgan did a report, and we couldn't find sort of it's a little bit grainy because we took it from the web. We couldn't find the source report. But when you look on this curve, sort of where the countries sit, and you see that the US is still at the early stage of what JP Morgan calls an acceleration phase, then all the stuff we're seeing at the moment in the US is really only the beginning. I think many people here, and forgive me for my European pessimism, but I spent the last 2 weeks in Europe, I think are just underestimating what's coming. So what you should be thinking about is sort of sharing a little bit more how we work this with clients about this. So for example, I'm going to have a meeting with Travel Oregon later today, where we're going to take the executive team to a report along the same methodology what I showed here, but we specifically looked around conversation in the state of Oregon, travelers to the state of Oregon, and so on. And the reason why we do that, what you should be thinking about it is, you got to understand what are people talking about in the markets where you source from, right? So if New York City, or if you are a Florida destination and the Midwest is an important source market for spring break, you need to understand what people in the Midwest are thinking. It doesn't matter what people in Florida are saying. It's about sort of where the people are coming from. You also need to look at, can people still get to your destination? Well, airlines are going to reduce frequency. People might be uncomfortable get on airplanes. Are they talking about saying, I'm going to take a road trip instead? I think there's opportunity to shift markets. You need to think about the product you have and how it's impacted. Any destination that has outdoor options, I think there is ways to promote that and saying you might not go to the amusement park, but you can go hiking, you can do outdoor stuff and keep a safe 6 feet distance from any other human being. But there will be impacts in terms of restaurants closing, stores closing, and so on. And so the whole question around events, what can people do in destination, is an important one that needs to be addressed. Normally, DMOs would be sending out newsletters now that would say, spring is festival season, these are the things you can sign up for, and so on. Those are probably not going to happen anymore or be a draw. So you need to figure out what else can you talk about, and sort of the sentiment stuff that I showed you is sort of we are using that to really help clients make informed decisions specifically for their destination. Where should we market? How much money should we spend there? Is the creative that we have still the right one? What are consumers thinking? Yeah, so this is sort of, this is the last slide. So sort of the stuff that we are watching, I mentioned some of it, but again, it might be helpful when as you talk to your teams. We are comparing what people are saying in key source market versus in destination. We've also picked up on some stuff where people in a market are saying, we don't want tourists to come to our town anymore because they bring the coronavirus. I think there is also messaging that needs to happen from the DMO to locals and keeping them informed on how this is being handled. You can look at destinations versus a competitive set. So just picking one sort of, how is what's being said about Seattle different than Denver, for example, or Chicago, and what's around our travelers choosing to stay closer to home and doing road trips instead of traveling further, and how do you shift your marketing? From the canceled events, we have some clients who have also big events that got canceled, and our recommendation there is, you can see how this plays out. There is a pattern that repeats itself when events are canceled or conferences. Pick an event and look at sort of what are people saying about South by Southwest, just to pick one. And the same thing will play out whether it's Comic-Con or whatever it is. So you need to look at, are people upset? How long are they upset? What are the questions they're asking? That the trend is sort of to postpone events and not to cancel them, which is great, but I think we'll talk about that in the fall, what's happening then. But there's also insights around, are people, for example, if I take South by Southwest, are people saying it's too bad that South by Southwest is not happening anymore, but we'll still go to Austin because Austin is a great destination, and we have a hotel or an Airbnb or whatever. So how can you message around getting people to still come even if an event is not happening? And we're always looking out for the people who manage social media. I think you want to start preparing frequently asked questions to equip your staff that manages your Facebook and Twitter accounts to be ready to answer questions when people ask, my hotel in your destination didn't give me a refund or allow me to cancel, do something for me. Is it safe to come? Are restaurants open? What can I do? And you want to give them guidance around messaging, brand voice, and all that stuff. And you also want to look at who are people, especially on who are the locals that can speak for you and encourage friends that it's still safe to come and life is normal and so on. The whole play staycation or visiting friends and relatives, I think, is a short-term opportunity. And then the ultimate question, and I think that's going to become a bigger one in the next week, is when are people ready for the new normal, right? Are we insensitive on still marketing? And my answer would be no, it's just got to be the right message. But when has this passed? When is it back to normal? What's the new normal looking like? So this is also stuff where we look at the data we have and we talk about with clients on making sure that they don't message the wrong way. And I think that brings me to my last slide. So back to you, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Martin, and some really valuable advice there. I'm going to summarize 7 sort of critical takeaways, which will both reinforce a couple of Martin's points and highlight some of the other things you need to be thinking about. One question, Martin, that came through that you can perhaps clarify. So Ashley's asking, how are you filtering out brands or news sources from your social media monitoring to ensure they're not skewing the sort of insights that you're collecting and sharing?
That is a great question, and the answer to that is it depends on the report. For some reports, we want the news sources included because when you measure the sentiment, a lot of people retweeting, I don't know, can be something President Trump says about travel, is an indication of what the sentiment is if they just retweeted itself, or maybe they comment on that. We can go in and saying we want to know everything that the people are saying about Marriott, but we don't want to include what Marriott is saying about itself, for example. So it's there's a sort of when we build these monitors, there's hundreds or thousands of keywords that we put in, and depending on what that's why I come back to the earlier what is the question, right? So if you say we want to know what people are saying, but we don't want any brands to be included in conversation, we can go and exclude those. But we, as a default, we don't exclude news sources or brands.
Okay, yeah, obviously it's not a perfect science, but as you pointed out, at volume and over periods of time, it can create some very important insights. So just a reminder, we'll be sending out an email 24 hours after this webinar that will share these links. So you'll the full research report from the State of the American Traveller, the slides from the full deck, plus from Dave and Martin's will be available separately. We'll actually be also sharing the full recording, plus a breakout of, again, Dave and Martin's section. So just wanted to highlight a couple of other resources, particularly in the crisis communication area. So this is a somewhat different and for some unusual, but actually the WTTC crisis readiness report that's shown on the right actually looked at in detail crises over the last 20 years that impacted the travel and tourism industry. They've looked at the past epidemics, whether it's SARS or MERS, and the strategies and policies that worked most effectively then. So we're in unprecedented territory, but there's some great resources there on both what's happened in the past and some advice for the future. You can see the UNWTO toolbox for crisis communication. You do have to purchase that report. It is a few years old, but still very definitive and a lot of very important lessons. I think it's only €50 though. And Destinations International is working on a crisis communication toolkit, actually working with Miles on that, and that will be available very shortly. So we'll be sharing those resources in this follow-up email as well. And 7 sort of key takeaways that I just wanted to wrap up before we come to the additional questions. We've already heard how fast and flexible these entire events are. So you and your team, this is going to be a stress test for how adaptable you are as an organization and as destination or tourism professionals. Focusing obviously on facts and what is real. Reminder that as of yesterday, there was only 4,300 deaths worldwide from coronavirus. So even though obviously there is a real and concerning health risk, all of us need to keep perspective on this. We need to show leadership, both being an advocate for travel when it's safe and appropriate, and an advocate for collective and government action, because the size and scale of these impacts are going to be very pronounced, and we're going to need to work together to address some of the significant fallout that's going to happen. One thing I wanted to highlight that is real and meaningful, and Martin mentioned it, is the whole issue of cancellation policy. So working with your local community, businesses, hotels on immediately offering the most generous cancellation and refund policies possible is certainly going to be one way to reduce risk in the minds of travelers and get people traveling where it's appropriate. So surfacing and highlighting that so people can feel confident that they can make a booking and if the situation changes, they can get their money back. I think that's something immediate we can all do. There's an immediate opportunity, obviously, to activate your local market. So where it's appropriate and safe, and in many places it still absolutely is, we need to be encouraging people to get out and about, using restaurants, going and doing activities, and it's actually a great opportunity to connect and engage with your residents. So to highlight the importance of the travel and tourism industry, build more effective engagement with your residents, start communicating with them about specific opportunities that exist now, but use that relationship when things get back to normal to ensure that we've got resident support and understanding around travel and tourism, which has been an issue, particularly in periods of crowd and congestion over tourism, which inevitably we are going to see some sort of pent-up demand and potentially a very sort of significant issue around growth once things do return back to normal. We need to obviously take a long-term view. So if you're going to be moving marketing dollars around and you're going to be focusing on, for example, the locals market or drive markets, ensuring that you're demonstrating long-term commitment to whether it's international markets or other important markets is key. So that might mean continuing to invest in some targeted marketing, even advertising, to ensure that they understand that they're important to you in periods of crisis as well as in good times. And in fact, these are times when those sorts of actions can really help build long-lasting, deep relationships. And this is, I think, a very important opportunity to think about our own organization. So whether you're a destination marketing organization, a hotel, an activity, an agency, we've got an opportunity for some significant change that often can be sort of overlooked in periods of growth and everything's good, but the opportunity to really reflect on the role, the capabilities, the funding of our organization. How can we reshape that to be more future-proofed and more relevant to how travel and tourism has become an absolutely huge sort of part of our global economy. So that both accentuates the problems we've got in the short term, but creates an opportunity medium to long term to get ready for what still is an optimistic long-term future for travel and tourism. Okay, so we've just got a couple of minutes left. A reminder that all of these resources will be sent out in that email summary. And I'm just having a quick look at any other questions that have come in right now. Question from Bob. Dave, if you're still with us, when is the announcement? When are you expecting to have more information about the tourism and travel monitor that you mentioned in terms of more current and immediate research?
Yeah, our intention is to work through the weekend and get it done by Monday for the first report, and then from then on do it on a weekly basis.
And no doubt that frequency can change depending on how fast moving or the situation is. And certainly from Miles' perspective, we're looking at bringing in some data from trusted partners where appropriate to add to that research. So there'll be more on that early next week, and we'll keep everybody up to date. So why don't we wrap it up now? I know everybody's incredibly busy. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, Dave, for your time. Thank you, Martin, for your time and the efforts of both your teams in bringing this information. We'll stay in close contact. Best of luck to everybody, and we'll look forward to working with you as we go through some really challenging times, but times that also will bring some real opportunities, I think. All the best. Goodbye.